Today, we're going to find out what happens when the granddaddy of affordable microbrands takes on a complication that you don't often see in watches less than 40 grand. And that's with the new Aragon Anti-Gravity Tourbillon. That's right, I said tourbillon. And for this one, you don't need to sell a kidney to get it. Although in my case, Wing and Aragon were kind enough to lend this one in to do the review. But afterwards, I am sending it back to them. Anyway, let's dive into this one and let's talk specs. Now, Aragon has a reputation for making some rather large watches, but in recent years they have been offering some smaller options. So while there is a 48mm version available of this one, the one I'm reviewing is only 42mm, and that's also with a lug-to-lug of 48. So smaller as far as Aragon is concerned, but it is more of a mid-sized watch. However, while it is smaller width-wise, be warned this one is a bit thick at 18mm, which does include an exhibition case back, as well as a nice-looking domed sapphire. But even with that, this one is a bit of a chunky monkey, and I'm not sure how much of that is the design and how much of it is due to that tourbillon movement. And with that thickness, it shouldn't be much of a surprise that this one is a bit hefty as well. It has a nice solid feel in the hand, but it's going to weigh in around 190 to 200 grams, depending on how many links you take off the bracelet. Although, considering just how tall and solid this one is, it's not bad on my 7¼ inch wrist. It's of course a bit top heavy, but the bracelet balances that out a bit, and overall wears fairly true to that 42mm size, albeit a pretty tall 42. Visually though, I think it looks even larger, and a lot of that is thanks to the expansive dial and slight magnification from the domed sapphire. Now, as for the bracelet, I wish there was a little more taper here, or some taper, and that it used female end links, but otherwise the bracelet itself is pretty decent for the price. Solid end links, solid fully articulating links, and a milled clasp. The design is a bit Spartan, but it is a typical Aragon brush tooly design. With one interesting aspect here being those male end links, as they go almost straight down before hitting the first link, and that does help to minimize some overhang. For the most part, I think we've actually covered most of my concerns with the watch, and that's thickness and weight. The rest of it is actually pretty straightforward. The case is very tool-watchy, or Aragonish, where it's a combination of brushed surfaces with some very subtle angles near the lugs, as well as a wide clean bezel that rises up to meet the curvature of the crystal. It's straightforward, maybe a little simple, but overall very clean. Now, as typical with Aragon, there are a number of different colorways, but the one they sent me is sort of a beige champagne version, which is complete with a sunburst effect leading out to the applied hexagon-shaped indices, and those fit snugly into the raised chapter ring, where the black painted chapter ring and the white lume of the indices come through rather clearly. Then, everything is topped off with a set of Delphine hands, which overall I think are far too short for this design. Thanks to the wide strip of lume down the middle, they are fairly easy to read, but the hour hand in particular seems awkwardly stubby. And as for that lume, it's there, but not overall great. We're basically talking Vostok levels of lume, which is probably appropriate for the design, but I always like to see a little bit more than that. So, like I was saying earlier, for the most part with this design, what you see is really what you get. It's straightforward, and here it's really more about that tourbillon. In fact, you could say the rest of the watch is rather subtle, and I think that's really to draw your focus more on the tourbillon, because that's really what makes this thing interesting and special. Now, if you don't know what a tourbillon is, you're probably looking at this one a little mesmerized, as well as a little confused. It's an older movement design, and there are a lot of other resources out there that can go into more detail and probably explain it better than I can. But the short version, at least as far as I understand it, is that it's a movement where the balance wheel and escapement are placed inside this rotating cage, rather than just staying stationary at the back. With the idea here that the rotation helps to minimize the positional bias a regular movement has thanks to gravity when it's put in various positions. I think the theory here is that by rotating, it helps to average all of that out. But basically, the time-regulating components are moved there in an effort to create a more accurate movement. And as a side effect, it looks rather cool while doing it. But like everything, there are pros and cons. And the cons to a tourbillon is that it's a rather complicated, hard to make movement, and thus also more expensive. This is why in the past, it was more of a specialized niche thing found only in the upper echelons of the luxury sphere. However, in recent years, things have changed, as a few years ago, Hangzhou developed this particular movement, the HC3C00. Now, Hangzhou is a Chinese movement manufacturer, and they made this to be a more mainstream option. It's still pricey, but it's nowhere near the astronomical price point of any other option out there. So some of you may have seen these movements around, some of you may have not, but they've been in circulation for a few years now, and specifically on some AliExpress watches. I've seen them pop up here and there, and I've been really interested in them. Yet, while I've been curious, and I like a good San Martin as far as the next guy, there was no way in hell I was going to spend $600 on a random branded Ollie watch. I just didn't think it was worth the risk. However, Aragon, this is a whole other story. Now, one of the big debates with tourbillons in general, not just a specific one, is whether or not they're really just a gimmick, or at the very least, a novelty watch. Theoretically, they do have the capability to be more accurate, yet the theoretical gains are very minimal compared to what you can get with a traditional movement. So the debate really centers around if they're worth that extra cost. And that's another reason they've always stayed as a novelty or very specialized niche watches in those upper echelons. Personally, I'm on the later side of that argument, as I think it's better to save your money than get something that's vastly more complicated, which offers only a marginal advantage, even if it is pretty mesmerizing to see. And this is a debate that holds true here as well as any tourbillon, even though we're talking here about a $650 watch, not a $40,000 watch. Now, one last thing I want to point out here is that while we watch geeks may understand this and be completely fascinated by it, don't expect regular people to be impressed with this thing. When this one showed up, I immediately showed it to my wife. I said, hey, check this out. This thing has a feature you won't see in watches less than $30,000 to $40,000. So she looked at it, then looked at me and said, what, it just rotates? And I looked back and said, yeah, it just rotates. She wasn't impressed. And to be honest, she's not really wrong either. It's cool, and I love these macro shots, but there's not really much of a point to it. And maybe sometimes you need somebody who's not obsessed with this stuff to point that out to you. Anyway, just throwing that out to you. But bottom line is that if you're someone who's obsessed with tourbillons, like completely obsessed, you have to have one, and you're not willing to sell a kidney to get it, then this one is probably your best option out there. However, for everyone else, I think you'd be better suited towards putting this money towards a more traditional movement. So plenty of other watches out there at this price point or less. And for you Aragon fans, this one could be one to consider. They also sent the Millipede Evo Seiko-based GMT for me to check out as well. And this one is in Samuel Jackson purple. It's a little bigger, but a really cool original design, and I'll have a review of this one soonish. Otherwise, that's all I got for you. Now, as usual, let me know your thoughts on this watch down below, as well as your thoughts on tourbillons in general. Are they beautiful engineered machines worthy of their price, or is it just a nice gimmick? Let me know. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help the channel. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.